If you go to myers.co/normality, that'll take you to my paper. This paper and this presentation is actually based on my concepts essay from the Masters in Jungian and Post-Jungian Study. What I'm going to do is I'm going to go through the content of that, and I'm going to make an appeal at the end for what I think the Centre should include as an aspect of its work in the next 20 years, just to stir things up. For a change, Roderick, I've really stirred things up. There are 5 parts to this presentation. I'm going to start briefly by asking whether Jung thought normality was an important concept in analytical psychology. Secondly, although Foucault, who had a lot to say about normality, although he didn't comment directly on Jung's work, he had plenty to say about psychoanalysis, and I'll therefore consider whether that criticism is relevant to analytical psychology. I'll take a very brief look at how the concept of normality has developed in post-Jungian thought. I'll then give what I think is the most appropriate definition of normality. And finally, I'll look at some of the implications of that definition and make my appeal. Okay, so let's start off with Jung's interest in normality. Was normality important to Jung? Well, actually, it waxed and waned during the second half of his life. In 1926, he introduced the word normal into the title of one of his 2 essays. And in 1930s, he cited Freud's alleged lack of inclusion of normality in his thinking as a factor in their separation. He used the term complex psychology to try and make his theory more of the normal population. But then in 1943, he took the word normal back out again. But then in 1948, he highlighted normality as one of the 4 main areas of future research. And this was at the opening of the C.G. Jung Institute in 1948, when he sketched out his wish list for the future of analytical psychology. And what he said was about normal psychology, he said the most important subjects for research would be the psychic structure of the family in relation to heredity, the compensatory character of marriage and of emotional relationships in general, and a particularly pressing problem is the behaviour of the individual in the mass and the unconscious compensation to which this gives rise. That was just after the Second World War, of course. So, just figure out where that came from. Right, so let's start just have a look at. Right, Foucault's criticism of Freud. Foucault didn't comment directly on Jung's theories, but he did criticise Freud, so I want to see whether they apply. What Foucault said, and lots of things, but here's a statement that summarises it. Psychiatric practice is a certain moral tactic that converges on Freud. To the doctor, Freud transferred all the structure that Pinel and Tuke had set up in confinement. So Foucault saw psychiatry as a way of imposing social norms on people, and Freud's psychoanalysis was basically doing the same thing, but with a different style of imposition. That was the basic substance hadn't actually changed. Need to press it harder. So Foucault saw Freud as using social norms to identify people who transgressed those norms. But actually, Foucault's criticisms of Freud really do miss the mark, because if you look at, and here are a couple of examples, actually I think the first might be a paraphrase rather than a direct quote. So in the interpretation of dreams, Freud talks about normality being when the pre-conscious and the unconscious are not in conflict. Or in the psychopathology of everyday life, he talks about normality being free from neurosis. These types of definitions do not rely on social norms. They have an intra-psychic focus. And in fact, Foucault himself criticised for his stance. For example, 2 critics of Foucault, Whitebook and Gutting, separately have pointed out that Foucault didn't actually recognise what Freud was on about. Whereas Foucault said the formulations Freud hears are always those of transgression, Whitebook and Gutting said, and I paraphrase here, Foucault could never give up the temptation to valorise transgression. He looked only at the context in which psychoanalysis developed, and he didn't engage with Freud's actual theory. Freud's theory of normality was not driven by social norms. However, if you look at post-Freudian definitions of normality, it's a different matter. There have been lots of people who've taken the definition and the concept of normality in lots of different directions. Some examples on the screen there. Some of these do retain Freud's intra-psychic focus, but some of them consider social norms. Glover, for example, defined normality in terms of a social standard of adaptation. So, as an overall theme, we could say that Foucault's criticism of Freud was not relevant because he didn't recognise the intrapsychic basis of Freud's thinking. That's why I've got a red cross there. But Foucault's criticisms could have some relevance to later psychoanalysis because there's a more diverse understanding of normality, which includes social functioning. So maybe, I'll give Foucault a tip, perhaps, for his criticisms applying to later on. So he might have got something right for the wrong reasons. With Jung, however, I think the situation is somewhat reversed. You know, if not completely reversed, but had Foucault looked at Jung's early work, he would have found plenty of grounds for complaint. For example, in his experiments on word associations, Jung first collected data from normal subjects so that he could then subsequently identify and distinguish pathological results. And that was exactly the type of thing that Foucault was criticising. In later life, however, Jung changed his view quite a lot. In fact, had Foucault and Jung got together, and had they overcome any semantic differences, which there are some, then they actually might have found some synergy. For example, there are similarities between the concerns that Jung expressed about collectivization and those that Foucault expressed about normalization. They aren't identical concepts, but there is some overlap between them. So, let me turn to the question of what about the work that has been done since Jung. Again, this is almost the mirror image of psychoanalysis, whereas there has been a lot of post-Freudian work on the concept of normality. In analytical psychology, it's notable more by its absence. Jung's ideas have had a big impact on normal life, but this has been more by accident than design. The concept of normality itself has been neglected. I mean, on the positive side, on the left-hand side, you know, many writers have described the archetypal stages of life. Jung's ideas have been applied to areas such as the social sciences. There has been some discussion of the concept of normality, but it's generally been in opposition to pathology. And I obviously should add that the applications module here at Essex does look at applying Jung's theory to normal areas, non-therapeutic areas. But there's no entry for normal in a critical dictionary of Jungian analysis. There is an entry for normal in the equivalent Freudian publication. Jung and the post-Jungians cite mostly the work of psychoanalysts. And it's not a reflection on Andrew, because he's done as much as anybody to apply analytical psychology to normal life. It reflects the lack of analytical psychological material for him to draw on. It was mostly work with psychoanalysts that he could use. There was very little on the Jungian side. And just as an example, Marion Woodman, the Jungian analyst, positions analytical psychology in a way that it seems it's not relevant for what she calls happy carrot normal. It's just positioning it in that way that it's a phrase that sticks in my mind as, you know, creating a clear non-application. So what this means is that for any work that applies analytical psychology to normality, actually we're missing a cornerstone, which is the definition of what normality is as far as analytical psychology is concerned. In psychoanalysis, I think that's been debated and lots of work being done on that. It also means that the territory has been left. It also means that the territory has been left open for others to make of it what they like. And in practical terms, that means that the biggest group representing analytical psychology to the world are Myers-Briggs or MBTI practitioners, or with similar instruments. There are probably 50 to 100,000 people in the world who've been qualified to administer the MBTI. I don't know how many Jungian analysts there are, but I would guess it's a lot less than that. Now, why is that a concern? Well, Jung was once asked, Isabel Briggs-Myers wasn't named, but it was talked about, he was asked about the use of his psychological type theory in America. And what he said was, God preserve me from my friends. This slide shows some of the differences between his theory and Myers-Briggs' theory. The detail, I'm not going to go through the detail of the differences, the detail doesn't matter. The point is, of what I've been saying so far is that Jung thought normality as a topic was important. However, it has been neglected, and as a result, the main use of his theories in the normal population have taken a direction which he saw as problematic. And that's the situation I think we're in as far as analytical psychology is concerned. So, in order to obtain a definition of normality, we have to go back to Jung's work, because so far there hasn't been any post-Jungian, substantial post-Jungian development on the topic. So how do you define normality? Well, here's one definition which might seem a bit simplistic. By normal, I mean a person who could somehow exist under all circumstances which afford him the minimum needs of life. However, there's a lot more to this than meets the eye. And I think we can best understand his definition of normality if we look at his high-level goal for analytical psychology. The main purpose of analytical psychology is the better adaptation of human behaviour, and adaptation in two directions. Illness is faulty adaptation. To external life, profession, family, society, and secondly to the vital demands of his own nature to bring it to the right pitch of development. And Jung illustrated this with the metaphor of specific gravity. He said it is as though every individual had a specific gravity in accordance with which he either rises or sinks down to the level where he reaches his limit. And he uses this definition to say that there are two types of neurosis. When the individual is out of balance on one side or the other of normality, and the two types of neurosis are either collective people with underdeveloped individuality or individualists with atrophied collective adaptation. Right, that's his understanding of normality in a nutshell, very short. And what I want to do is to look at some of the implications of that understanding of normality. I've got 12 minutes, 23 seconds on my watch. I have to speed over time, right? Right. I'm going to look at some of the implications. Right, the first one is that it's normal for the psyche to split, and complexes are normal. And a couple of quotes. Given the fact that I've got 3 minutes less than I thought I had, I'll not go through the quotes. I will pick on the second one, where it says the presence of autonomous complexes is not itself pathological, since normal people too fall temporarily or permanently under their domination. This fact is simply one of the normal peculiarities of the psyche. And I think the sophistication of Jung's understanding of normality is illustrated by this oxymoronic phrase, normal peculiarities. And there is a parallel use of the word normal in statistics. If I have the right slide of those, there is a parallel use of the word normal in statistics when you look at a normal distribution. Normality is not a particular psychic state, but an overall pattern that embraces a wide range of emerging psychic states, including peculiar ones. So this is similar to saying that a normal distribution is not just a single average result, which is the one in the middle, but an overall pattern that emerges from a wide range of results, including ones at the extreme end of the curve. Incidentally, both Freud and Jung use the same phrase to say that the normal man is a fiction. Sorry, I use the word man, I'll try and avoid that. But they both said the normal man is a fiction. And what they meant is very different. I think Freud, it meant no one's free from the influence of unconscious neuroses. For Jung, it meant that no one is identical to the average. So although they use the same expression, what they meant by this was quite different. Another implication of Jung's definition of normality is that the conflicts are both conflict. Well, they're both conscious. The mental and moral conflicts of normal people are of a somewhat different kind to neurotics. The conflicting opposites are both conscious. This has massive implications. And I could go, for about 3 hours. No? I'll just pick on a couple. I think one of the things is it explains why Myers-Briggs theory is so popular, because that's about conscious opposites mostly. There is a little bit of dealing with the shadow and so on, but it's like going to the sewers and lifting the lid up and saying, oh, look, there's a sewer down there, and putting the lid back down. That's the extent to which it's done. They talk about archetypes and so on, but it perhaps also explains why CBT is so popular, because CBT was evaluated and has been chosen and has been developed within a normal paradigm, which focuses very much on conscious conflicts. And it also shows why compensation arises and why Jung was so concerned about it, because the unconscious is not being paid attention to in the normal population. So, compensation. Compensation isn't necessarily a bad thing because it can take benign forms. So, for example, dreams. Dreams can actually be a benign form with some symbols, and they can be effective even when they're not understood. And it's akin to the keel of a boat, sort of under the water, maintaining balance and direction. Although Jung doesn't state this explicitly, I get a sense when reading his writings on normality that there are actually two opposing principles at play here. One is that for the sake of the individual, it's actually best that we don't try to advance consciousness, because that can be quite dangerous, and you don't want to risk upsetting the balance. But on the other hand, the opposite side of the coin is that doing nothing is dangerous for society, because the compensation aggregates at a collective level, and so we therefore have to do something. And these are a couple of famous quotes. Again, because of time, let's go on to the second one. Man's worst sin is unconsciousness, and in all seriousness, we need to seek ways and means to exercise him, to rescue him from possession and unconsciousness, and make this the most vital task of civilization. Strong words, well, he uses strong words quite a lot, doesn't he, actually, but they are strong words. The essence of the problem is that normality does not pay attention to the unconscious, but and I accept that, but what I'm also saying in this presentation is that analytical psychology has paid too much attention to the unconscious, perhaps, and has neglected the conscious processes, doesn't worry too much about the conscious processes that take place in the normal population, which Jung was concerned about. And let me just give you an illustration. I'm not talking about psychotherapeutic applications here. Right, but this is the Wikipedia page. The overarching goal of Jungian psychology is the attainment of self through individuation. And I've put a big red across to it because I think it's wrong. Right? Although individuation is very important, it is not the only goal for normal people. In fact, it's not even the only goal in therapy, actually. The way that Jung positioned individuation was at one end of the spectrum. The overarching goal individuation and collectivity are a pair of opposites, two divergent destinies. And he talked elsewhere about people needing to find their own destiny on that spectrum. And he says, to reinforce the point, there are countless people who are not only collective, but whose ambition is to be nothing but collective. So ironically, an exclusive focus on individuation presents analytical psychology in a one-sided way. And it misses the point that individuation and collectivity are themselves a pair of opposites. Not enough attention is therefore paid to collective conscious processes, and more importantly, perhaps how the two integrate. There's one final implication that I want to explore that builds on this difference between individuation and collectivity, and it's concerned with how someone develops when they increase consciousness. In two essays, Jung makes the following observation. Raising the personal unconscious to consciousness makes one less individually unique and more collective. Well, this can be illustrated by using this graph. Right. So on the top we have the spectrum between individuation and collectivity, and on the left-hand side we have the levels of the unconscious, the personal unconscious down to the collective unconscious. And what Jung is saying is that as one becomes more aware of the personal unconscious, moving down, one also becomes more collective, moving to the right. And as one goes further and moves into the collective unconscious, it starts to become more individual through realization of self. Let me just overlay Jung's statement on that so that you can see how it relates to the graph. So raising the personal unconscious to consciousness makes one less individually unique and more collective. this statement by Jung is not an isolated one. He says something similar several times in both two essays and psychological types. In fact, he describes psychological type as, in effect, a collective psychology, primarily concerned with your persona. That is, identifying with a type or a function makes you more collective. Jacobi also says a similar thing because she's described analysis of the personal unconscious as being an adjustment to external reality. So, this is my last slide you would like to know. In Normality, and the word persona has come up several times today, the persona is actually a very important factor in the equation, because the persona is a portion of the collective psyche who does, in two essays, associate psychological type with the persona. So my final point, therefore, is that the focus in analytical psychology has tended to be on the ego-self axis, and that's quite rightly so when we're talking about individuation. But when we're talking about collectivity, the ego-persona axis is also very important. And when we're looking to develop through the emergence of the transcendent function, that function has to transcend both the opposites. Well, that's very difficult if you think that in the normal population they don't pay attention to the unconscious. So again, there's a bit of a conundrum there. So the appeal that I'm putting forward is twofold. The first one is that I would like in the future to make sure that we maintain a difference, a clear difference between psychoanalysis and analytical psychology. Because I feel that there's always a danger of some of the golden nuggets in Jung stuff being lost through assimilation into psychoanalysis. A relationship is between two entities, and we need to make sure that we maintain two entities. You can have a dialogue between the two entities, that's fine, but let's be careful that we don't lose some of these golden nuggets like this one on Normality, I think, and maintain a dialogue between the two, so keep them clearly separate. And the second appeal that I'd like to make is that when we look at future research, we try to encourage more research in the area of normality. Jung said it was important in 1948. I think it's important, but I think it's more important than just me looking at it in terms of a concept. I know that Jungian stuff's been applied in lots of areas, but we're looking at the concept of normality. So I think that's an area of research we need to make sure we pay attention to. Thank you very much.